let's go on. Okay, so it's my pleasure. It's my great pleasure to introduce you to the first speaker today, Professor Adrian Pablé, who is Associate Professor of the School of English in the University of Hong Kong since 2009. He's a member of the editorial boards of several international journals and supervises postgraduate projects in integrational linguistics, critical linguistics, semiotics, philosophy of language, history of linguistics, and folk perceptions of the linguistic past. His recent publications include Sign, Meaning, and Experience, Integrational Approach to Linguistics and Semiotics, together with Professor Chris Hitton, and the co-edition of Integrationism through the lens of Southern linguistics theory, together with Integrational Makoni, and the co-edition of New Directions for Integrational Linguistics, together with Professor Dorothy Dunker. The title of his talk today is The Lay Orientation of Integrational Approach. And Professor Adrian, thank you very much for your virtual presence here today. And please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Christine. Good evening, everyone. Unfortunately, I can't see anyone except for Christine. But I hope you can hear me all right. Do you think the audio is okay, Christine?
Yes.
Am I loud enough?
Yes, it's being transmitted. So we have a new link of transmission. We are going to share with everyone else. Okay, we can go on. Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so my paper today is entitled The Lay Orientation of Integrational Approaches. I'm going to talk a little bit about the idea of a lay-oriented linguistic theory as opposed to a lay theory of language, and which then, of course, I will also contrast to a scientific theory of communication. So these are the three kind of approaches that I'm going to be comparing in my paper today. So I'm going to read my paper, and then after I've read it, I will be happy to have a discussion with you. Okay, so viewing the history of academic linguistics through the sociopolitical lens reveals that epistemological and ontological beliefs about language reflect the politics of their times. Saussure, for instance, produced the Magna Carta of modern linguistics with his proposal of a new science called semiology against the backdrop of nationalist Europe, in which the seminal concept of a collective system of signs called the language, la langue, applied to uniform communities of speakers who were powerless to change anything about this institutionalized psychological reality that they had inherited as members. In other words, Saussure's apolitical vision of a general linguistics belonging to the psychological sciences could be regarded as precisely the result of a certain socio-political late colonial climate, and hence as biased in this sense. At the same time, Western linguistic thought is biased in another sense. It is the product of a literate society which has its intellectual roots in ancient Greece. Academic linguistics is the modern offspring, which paradoxically professes a phonocentric creed. Are there then any recurring ideas about language that have gripped the minds of thinkers steeped in a literate upbringing? Writing, it has been argued, enables us to externalize language as an object of scrutiny and thus to alienate it from ourselves. Arguably, once we approach language in this way, we have already deprived ourselves of any possibility of understanding it. Scientific linguistics, on this view, is just as ideological as a colonial linguistics. In this paper, I would like to propose that linguistic inquiry should be lay-oriented. This is, I believe, one way of avoiding the pitfalls that linguistic theory and communication theory bring with them. Integrational linguistics is such a lay-oriented approach. It was developed in Oxford during the late 1970s and early 1980s by Roy Harris and his associates to challenge the prevailing segregational discourse of the orthodoxy. In 1981, Harris published The Language Myth, a book devoted to the historical study of how language had been conceptualized in Western intellectual thought. By myth, Harris was referring to a fossilized form of thinking within cultural traditions, virtually gone unchallenged for so long that it has hardened into a kind of intellectual concrete. A myth, Harris argues, captures some higher or symbolic truth and cannot thus be easily dispelled, even if shown to be based on illusion or factual error. On the contrary, myths are appealing because they seem to explain certain things that would otherwise remain mysterious. In fact, the language myth in the Western tradition, as Harris identified it, provides a plausible explanation of how speakers A and B can communicate with each other, even though they are two persons with their own individual bodies and minds. The rationale behind the myth has always been to argue that communication serves to make private and thus invisible ideas known to others, which is possible because human beings have internalized the same set of abstract signs. Knowing what a word means is knowing the idea or thought behind a word. Harris identified two theses that make up the language myth in Western intellectual thought: the telementation fallacy on the one hand, and the fixed code fallacy. As I mentioned before, Harris identified literacy as a potent factor in the way language and languages have been imagined and theorized, leading to externalizing and objectifying what is actually a highly personal and continuous phenomenon. Harris spent a good part of his career critiquing Western linguistic thought, arguing that the roots of the language myth lie in the human ability to decontextualize communication and treat language as separate and separable from the rest of ongoing human activities. Harris has argued that the dehumanization of language brought about by institutionalized literacy ultimately opened the doors to a scientific understanding of languages as countable entities that take priority over their speakers. Harris was well aware of the real dangers inherent in segregational approaches to language, i.e., theories subscribing to the thesis that linguistic communication presupposes languages, which he regarded as a metaphysical assumption. Harris was clear that his critique of the language myth was not just intended as an intellectual exercise, a language philosopher's musings from an Oxford armchair, but also aimed at tangible problem areas like language politics and language education. The following passage by Harris sounds very much like something that a critical applied linguist or a post-colonial linguist would say. It is at this crucial point, I quote, that the language myth begins to reveal its ugly side. Once the reversal of priorities is accepted, by which communities are defined by reference to languages, and this reversal is propagated in the name of education to generation after generation, it straightaway feeds the taproots of ethnocentrism, nationalism, social discrimination, and many of the nastier forms of politics, as well as the cultural imperialism that nowadays promotes the notion of a miraculously neutral world language, coincidentally called English, already in place, end of quote. Starting from the early 1980s, Roy Harris's work became known within academic circles for its trenchant critique of the language sciences as heavily ethnocentric. Few fellow linguists, however, realized that Harry concomitantly developed an alternative theory, integrationism or integrational linguistics. The integrationist thesis is in direct contradiction with the idea of an independent field of inquiry centered on languages. Instead, it takes communication as the point of departure and declares languages as the product of communication, not the prerequisite. Its creed therefore runs, languages presuppose communication and not communication presupposes languages. Harris's notion of communication is built around the conviction that a human individual's life forms a continuum of activities, with any activity here and now being integrated on multiple levels contemporarily. Two or more activities are thus said to be integrated if one is interpreted as complementing the others. Reading to you aloud what I have written previously, which is what I am presently doing, presupposes that the activities of reading, speaking, and thinking must be integrated activities rather than separate ones, even though we may consider them separately. Whereas if I'm reading the very same text aloud to myself with no one listening to me, these activities, while being the same in some sense, are also different ones because the situation is entirely different. Crucially then, Harris's theory covers both types of communication, communication with oneself and interpersonal communication. The language-related activities that lay linguistic thinking commonly recognizes and mainstream linguistics theorizes on are those of speaking, listening, writing, and reading. In applied linguistics and sociolinguistics, these activities are expressed through the term languaging or wording, the gerund form acknowledging that linguistic communication is an activity, itself comprised, as the integrationists would add, of an infinite number of constituent activities. Integrational key theoretical concepts are lay-oriented in the sense that lay speakers recognize that, for example, speaking and listening are activities. However, the integrationist is not interested in a scientific study of activities. For a lay-oriented linguistics in Harris's sense, there is no science capable of dealing with human activities. Instead, the notion of an activity is open-ended. That is, what counts as an activity cannot be determined from the outside. Lay people may disagree about whether something counts as an activity, or if they do agree, they may disagree about how to label it. What the integrationist asserts, however, is that activities are indispensable to make any sense of human life. That kind of assertion doesn't require any scientific definition of an activity. Scientific definitions are needed to compartmentalize the study of communication and create specialist niche, which is precisely what integrationism stands opposed to. Pivotal in a truly lay-oriented linguistic theory is its disinterested stance when it comes to the various lay views on language and communication within and across cultures. Rather, a lay-oriented theory must try to unify all of these views without treating them as intersubstitutable. How can that be accomplished? In order to answer this question, let us check the validity of various theoretical concepts we are familiar with and assess whether they fit a lay-oriented approach. The notion of a language countable, the integrationist argues, is not part of it. Why not? Because languages are not necessary for developing a theory capable of coping with communication as a first-order phenomenon. Languages, for the integrationist, belong to the second order. The criterion for inclusion or exclusion is thus not whether languages are part of lay linguistics, as clearly they are, at least in Western lay linguistics, but whether they contribute towards explaining communication as integration of activities. The metalinguistic explanations, we communicated in English, for example, or I understand her because she's able to speak English, refer to something external to the communicating person, i.e., the label English does not fulfill the general criterion of being lay-oriented insofar as this seemingly objective term could be, and in fact is, disputed. An explanation of communication which is disputable, however, is not lay-oriented, though it might very well represent a specific type of lay view belonging to a specific cultural sphere. The rejection of languages as a countable noun, the integrationist argues, follows from introspecting our personal communicational experience and checking it against the key theoretical notion of orthodox linguistic theory, that of languages as definable objects. A quote here, "The communicational world, says Harris, we inhabit does not divide into discrete verbal systems corresponding neatly to the language names currently in popular use. The epistemological rub is that once these postulated systems are recognized as being no more than convenient cultural fictions, it follows that there is no question of knowing any of them. End of quote. However, the integrationist retains language as a mass term as a key theoretical concept. Why? Because no theory of communication can afford to leave language out of its accounts. Some linguists think that language is a complex computational system. For the integrationist, language is nothing of that sort. Language is something we do. It's an integral part of human communication, and communication is an activity. And as such, language is also part of our personal linguistic experience. Moreover, language, like countable languages, just like countable languages, is talked about, a topic of discourse, and as such constrained by factors related to one's community. What commonly counts as language in the global north may thus be very different from what counts as language, for example, in the global south, discursively speaking. Is there anything more general that we could say about linguistic experience then? One way to argue is that linguistic experience is human experience. Our linguistic experience may also be derived from encounters with animals, with trees, with the wind, with music, with nature. These encounters are part of our communicational biography. But we can't say much about how non-human beings or entities or even artifacts experience anything, let alone whether they have any linguistic experience. I know I experience language on a daily basis. I also know other human beings experience language on a daily basis. Do I know that about each and every human being? Not from personal experience, but I have to assume that human beings all possess linguistic experience, however varied that experience undoubtedly is. That is, every human being has his or her personal communicational history, of which linguistic experience is an integral part. This is what I have in common with all other human beings, past, present, and future. I may entertain community internal theories about other non-human beings or entities having language, or having had language but now no more, or having it sometime in the future. But in terms of the quality of linguistic experience, my reference point is human linguistic experience. Language is thus not a myth. Languages are. Another key term for the integrationist is the sign. Although the word is commonly used to denote a specific type of object or a particular event or occurrence, the sign as an integrationist term could be said to be almost a different word from how lay speakers use it, as indeed is Saussure's use of the term sign. Again, the lay understanding of what a sign is may be contentious in that one may wonder whether a particular example of a sign fits the overall definition of what constitutes a sign. For example, is a street sign whose writings are no longer legible still a sign? What if the signpost with directions on it is stored in my cupboard? Is it a sign while not functioning as a sign? In a similar way, the term English, if taken to have a scientific definition, can be taken to include certain instances. This is English, and exclude others. This is not English. In turn, from an integrational point of view, signs serve to integrate activities. The sign exists as long as it has an integrational function for someone. Thus, from an integrational point of view, it doesn't make sense to adopt a third-person perspective when it comes to deciding whether something counts as a sign or not. There is no sign class available against which we can check if a particular exemplar is a sign or not. Hence, the decontextualized question, is English a word, i.e. a sign, is not a theoretical question that belongs to a lay-oriented approach. The question needs further questions. A sign for whom? Under what circumstances? It is difficult to argue that the sign, thus conceived, is contentious. Since when is one's personal experience contentious? In the sense that its existence could be questioned. Thus, in Harris's semiological conception, a sign is not a second-order abstraction. Unlike a language, a sign is a first-order phenomenon without which we would not be able to create second-order concepts. The first-order sign is thus viewed by Harris as a universal of human communication. As he argues, quote, "It is difficult to see how any theorist who aspires to considering in a unified way the whole range of our communicational experience can adopt any other than a semiological point of view. A narrower perspective could not accommodate the sheer diversity of that experience." The sign, in other words, is a sine qua non for the development of a theory premised on being inclusive of this sheer diversity of human communicational experience. The integrational sign, or the integrated sign, Harris insists, is radically indeterminate in both form and meaning. This is not necessarily a lay view of the sign, but certainly a lay-oriented one. Paradoxically, the thesis of the radical indeterminacy of signs, while enabling the theories to transcend ethnocentric conceptions of communication, at the same time exposes him or her to the very charge of ethnocentrism on two accounts. Firstly, the study of signs as undertaken by semiotics and semiology is essentially a Western enterprise. Secondly, the Harrisian thesis of radical indeterminacy is linked to the conviction that every sign requires its maker, not makers, and that therefore meaning, the sign made, cannot be shared, as the signs integrating the activities require individuals who make the signs that integrate. On this view, the signs are private and personal, including all intersubjective forms of cooperation. The Harrisian conception of the sign generally meets with a certain amount of perplexity among contemporary linguists. As a discourse analyst once put it to me, a sign that is radically indeterminate in both form and meaning, is that a useful concept? One consequence of adopting a lay-oriented perspective in integrational theorizing is that it frees one from community internal constraints as to what constitutes language as a mass term, a language as a countable term, or communication. Adopting such a perspective may sharpen my awareness of what my community construes a language or language to be, and thus to recognize the limits of such a construal without losing sight of the possibilities that this construal brings with it. In the integrationist activity-centered picture of humans, language can no longer play a separate and separable role from the rest of human activities, but must be treated as embedded in those very activities. The integrationist recognizes no strict separation between linguistic and non-linguistic activities, the very separation of which is the mainstay of linguistics as an academic field of knowledge. Like the notion of a language, the distinction between linguistic and non-linguistic is a lay distinction as well as a professional one. However, for theoretical purposes, the integrationist claims this distinction distorts our experience of communication. Pas que so sûr, there are no abstract linguistic signs leading a separate metaphysical existence as signs of a language. From an integration point of view, the sign is creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing, out of nothing, whose momentary existence solely serves the fleeting communicational function of the here and now, as construed by the sign maker or sign makers. In this sense, signs are said to be made. From a postulated third-person perspective, one could only declare the sign to be radically indeterminate in both form and meaning. From the point of view of the sign maker, however, signs are as determinate as they can be or need to be for the present communicational purposes, in direct relation to the sign maker's integrational proficiency, that is, knowledge of how to integrate one's own semiological activities with those of others. A crucial insight in Harris's thinking about communication is the realization that communication is a lay perspective, not a fact. Or as he puts it, quote, "Communication is not what happens in some definable segment of a chain of events in human interaction, We can never say communication begins here with this event and ends there with that event. To think of communication in those terms is already to fall victim to something akin to a category mistake. Communication is not a sequence of events distributed in time, but a perspective from which certain kinds of sequence may be understood. It is furthermore a lay perspective as distinct from one constructed by theorists. End of quote. Sign-making can only occur along the continuum of one's personal communication biography. The individual interprets activities as being connected, while his or her interpretations cannot be detached from the very continuum they form a part of. What someone said yesterday may become relevant for me right now, while it may never become relevant to anybody else ever, including the person who said it. Hence, Harris's emphasis on communication as a process. Which activity complements which other activity cannot be judged from a third-person perspective, even though individuals may reach the same conclusions when establishing the facts. To circumscribe a certain communication episode as having occurred between A and B is to somewhat artificially sever a sequence of activities that occurred as part of the respective communicational continua of A and B, and of whoever else witnessed it. As lay people, we do treat communication as discontinuous all the time, but doing it as a communication theorist is quite a different matter. The radically open nature of an integrational theory of communication shows in the way Harris accounts for the species and culture-specific limitations within which human communication must happen. Thus, the human communicational universe is said to be constrained by factors of three kinds: biomechanical, what the human being is mentally and physiologically equipped to do; circumstantial, what the human being is able to do given certain circumstances; and macrosocial, how human beings are collectively conditioned. Whatever the communicational practices and beliefs in a community are, the human being is communicationally constrained by these three interdependently operating parameters. If talking to the wind is a macrosocially sanctioned practice, the circumstantial and biomechanical factors making the communication possible still obtain. Talking to the wind, listening to the wind, etc. will presumably not be possible anywhere and anytime, just as talking to another person is not. The integrationist insists that we are time-bound beings. An integrational theory, therefore, has little to say about claims that some people can be in different places at the same time, or that some people can have experiences of worlds that are not anchored in the here and now. These make up the rich inventory of lay communicational experience, and as such, need to be accounted for in anthropological work on the various folk theories of communication. As for the ontologies that these kinds of experiences have, the integrational theorists will have to take an agnostic stance. From a lay-oriented point of view, what matters ultimately is that individuals have to make signs that facilitate the integration of certain activities, which allow them to have such experiences in the first place. In this sense, the sign maker is another universal concept from an integration point of view. Even the most spiritual of experiences cannot completely do away with the biomechanical, circumstantial, and macrosocial constraints on human communication. As a theory, does integrationism represent an improvement to segregational theories? Harris must have thought that it does. He seems to hint at it when he points out that one way to judge a theory in terms of its intellectual biases is to ask oneself what questions pertaining to the phenomena falling within its domain cannot be raised within the theoretical framework it provides, rather than what range of explanations it makes available. In other words, the range of explanations that your theory provides is not how you measure the worth of your theory. A linguistic theory or a communication theory may still be biased. Instead, Harris suggests that when confronted with a theory, we should ask ourselves what we cannot explain. Segregational theories, for instance, cannot be aligned with our personal experience because language and communication have been objectified. There is no space for personal experience. Conversely, what cannot be explained from within an integrational theory, it could be argued that integrational theory, by rejecting languages as first-order realities, cannot provide descriptions of languages or explain how linguistic communication works. The argument, however, is question-begging. One cannot explain phenomena that one doesn't believe to exist, namely languages as definable objects or communication which is purely linguistic. It can hardly be counted as a theoretical weakness. Integrationists are able to provide an explanation as to why they believe languages don't exist, or why there is, strictly speaking, no such thing as a linguistic message. It is certainly the case that there are limits as to what an integrational theory can explain. These limits derive from the semiological stance that signs are radically indeterminate. The paradox here is that determinate signs will open up the range of explanations, while indeterminate signs will restrict them. That is, at the level of the third-person perspective. A scientific approach to communication requires determinate signs. A lay-oriented approach requires radically indeterminate signs. However, it is not a matter of choice. It is a matter of conviction, and we cannot have it both ways. The radically indeterminate sign, in both form and meaning, makes a lot of sense, but, as that discourse analyst put it, it may not be useful. And what he had in mind was useful for certain macro-socially institutionalized activities. Given that we live in a post-humanist age, we could ask the following. Does the lay orientation of the integrational approach to communication allow us to move beyond the limits of an anthropocentric perspective on language? If signs are radically indeterminate, might that not suggest that human signs and non-human signs may be comparable after all? Once we dismiss languages, we also dismiss Saussure's linguistic sign. Let us recall how integrational theory manages to be lay-oriented. It does so by asking us to make communicational sense of our own experience. To reflect on communication is ipso facto to reflect on one's own communicational experience. To say something general about communication presupposes being able to draw on one's own communicational experience. That is precisely what being lay-oriented means, and it is precisely how a lay-oriented view is incompatible with a scientific view. Taking a lay-oriented view presupposes that we do not question having an interior life. One only has access to one's own interior life. I cannot know anybody else's interior life. I wasn't born as anybody else. I was born as me. However wrong you may be about other human beings, we can still draw on commonalities, crucially the same communicational infrastructure, and within that given infrastructure, the same psychological and physiological possibilities and constraints. Nothing comparable applies to non-human beings. We just know nothing about their interior lives, regardless of however intimate we are with them or however closely we observe them. What we know about them stems from our encounters and our communication with them, which become part of our own experience. There is a fundamental difference between asking the question, what is it like to be a bat, and what is it like to be a human being? We can say nothing about the former, really, but we can say a great deal about the latter. Some intellectuals who see anthropocentrism as harmful are now talking about every species having their own language and about human beings having an unfair advantage over non-human beings, which consists in human beings being the only ones able to say of themselves that they possess language. As the Dutch philosophers Eva Meyer puts it as regards Aristotle's definition of humans as rational animals. Quote, I quote Mayer here, Aristotle is using human words to argue that using human words is what draws the line between who can speak and who cannot. And that, in turn, Mayer argues, seems to suffice for Aristotle as a justification to equal language with human language. If, like Mayer, you don't accept this equation, the next question to ask is whether metalanguage is by definition human, or whether animal metalanguage exists, but being human, we obviously don't know. The recent concerns with the so-called anthropocentric era has led to a new orientation in the humanities and recently also in linguistics, which only human beings are capable of. The turning away of human beings from themselves towards non-human beings. The animal turn, as it is called. One of the aims of the animal turn in linguistics, as one linguist recently argued, is to put the animal back on the linguistic research agenda, from which it had been banned due to anthropocentric language ideologies. What is implied in the claim that animals also possess language as a mass term, or possess their own language as a count term? It is clear that the so-called animal turn in linguistics is incompatible with the lay orientation as I have described it here. From an integration point of view, I can say that animals engage in intraspecies and interspecies communication, just as we do. They integrate various activities, and they do so by signs they make. But what are these activities they engage in? Are they macrosocially defined? It makes sense to suppose so, but I have no clue how the animal relates to its own activities. How do their interior lives allow them to understand their own integrational activities? How do they evaluate an activity? Once we identify language as being involved in animal communication, together with other modalities, these questions tend to disappear in favor of an empirical approach to how animals use language to communicate with members of their own species, with other animal species, and with humans, and what constitutes that language. A scientific framework is called for, ideally one maximally dehumanized. What we tend to forget, however, is that immunity to anthropocentrism can only be achieved through a massive injection of anthropomorphism. In fact, the argument runs like this. Humans are not radically different from non-humans. Animals had language long before Homo sapiens arrived on the scene. How can we study non-human language? By taking as our point of departures models of human linguistic communication. Language, in a way, cannot be reinvented. Where does this input to study animal languages come from? I believe Alastair Pennycook's Posthumanist Applied Linguistics, published in 2018, has motivated some linguists to contribute their own share in the decentering of humans as part of a larger project to save the planet. Pennycook, an anti-Cartesian, argues that language is distributed among and between species, materiality, place, and time, which allows for an undoing of species hierarchies. Based on this notion of language distribution and the concomitant critique of language and languages as having the fit for human minds, a deeply Saussurean position, the dialectologist Leonie Cornips has recently undertaken extensive research on Dutch dairy cow language. Cornips refers to the cows as linguistic actors, which produce the first pair in a greeting exchange with a human newcomer entering the cow barn. Together with another Dutch linguist, Mario van Koppen, Cornips presented a poster in 2019 on the grammar of cow language, which they claim is embodied and multimodal. Among other things, the Dutch cows are said to be able to express habituality as a verbal aspect. They can use negative imperatives. They express different degrees of modality. For example, I want versus I might want. They ask questions and they use inclusive we. Kornips calls this an inclusive linguistics. The project, from what I can see based on a cursory glance at the research done so far, exists in a historical vacuum. The researchers are not interested, for example, in the question how human-animal communication or animal-animal communication has been discursively constructed in Western lay linguistic thought. For example, St. Francis of Assisi was said to talk to animals, and the animals talked to him. What other accounts survive from the medieval records? And how do these traditions compare to Southern traditions of talking about language in non-anthropocentric ways? Kornips and her associates, however, are not really interested in letting the records speak. That would be to commit the fallacy of anthropocentrism. Instead, the professional linguist takes matters into their own hands, externalize language, declare it a universal among sentient beings, and, lo and behold, study animal language through the lens of Northern anthropocentric linguistics, be it in the form of a Chomskyan analysis or in the form of conversation analysis. Further questions arise in this context. Is it important that Kornips' research is done with Dutch cows? Is cow language subject to geographical variation? Are Dutch dairy cows able to distinguish between humans who speak Dutch and humans who, say, speak German? And so on. I will conclude by saying that a lay-oriented linguistic approach in the Harrisian sense can only be anthropocentric. Some will likely prefer a lay approach for this reason. However, lay linguistic approaches may eventually be incorporated into more orthodox linguistic theories. Western linguistics, for example, has always been parasitic on lay linguistics. A lay-oriented approach, in turn, is of little value to scientific theorizing. The question then is whether a lay-oriented approach, that is integrationism, can be valuable to lay theories of language and communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Adrian. Now we still have 20 minutes more for a debate, and there are some questions from the audience, and I also have some questions. Thank you for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
That is very inspiring, yeah, for our philosophy of linguistics. And one question is related to the concept of subject. Since science serves to integrate activities from a person's perspective, is there a certain concept of subject? What does it mean when you mention, for example, individual's perspective? So what is the concept of individuality or subjectivity that is there?
Yeah, I must confess I don't have a clear concept of individuality or personhood. I'm not quite sure how subjectivity, subjectivity, agency is, how these terms are being used actually in linguistic theory. So I think from an integrational point of view, what matters is that we have a person who has a personal history, right, which is only known to that specific person, and that this history, which is a continuum of activities and experiences, cannot be kind of cannot be externalized. So it has no third person perspective, right? It is only known to me. Okay, so there is no, I don't have a theory of what it means to be a person or to be a subject or to have agency, but I know from taking a lay-oriented perspective, I know that I have a past, right? And that I have a present in because I am here right now, and that I have a future, however short it may be, but I do have a future. So So these are, I think, these are the coordinates that I would orient towards, and that somehow seem to be bedrock concepts, right? I cannot deny that I am here, that I have a past, that I remember in certain ways, and that other people remember in other different ways, and I somehow I must be able to anticipate a future on this, and a personal future. So I think that is all that I can say about the idea of an individual or a person. So it's not a person in a legal sense, but a person as a conscious being that starts to exist at some point. But also a being who doesn't really, whose awareness in before he or she is born and after he or she is born is very different from one's adult life, for example, right? We do not really remember anything about our early childhood or the time before we were born. So, but still, I have to assume this is, well, and I know this is part of me, right? I couldn't be here if I hadn't had a certain history also as an unborn being.
Thanks, Adrian. There is one question from Ana Elterman. She's Brazilian. Her question is related to language teaching. So how can this approach, from your experience, from your perspective, contribute to language teaching experiences in classroom, for example?
Yeah, it's a very important question, right? I'm not an applied linguist, so I'm not, I don't have direct experience. Well, I do have, but it actually happened a long time ago, right? As a language teacher, right? I'm not in the language teaching enterprise or business, but obviously the rejection of languages as a first order phenomenon has a lot of repercussions and implications, right, for the teaching of languages to students of applied linguistics. But this doesn't apply to teaching languages to people who want to learn a foreign language, right? They don't want to. They don't care really about whether integrationists believe that languages exist or not, right? Because what matters for them is they have a certain concept of a certain language, let's say English, and that's what they want to acquire, right? And so it has some practical purposes. So these terms, even if they are rejected by the integrationists, that doesn't mean that they don't possess certain integrational functions, right? So this notion of a language still has important integrational functions in many societies, many human societies. So we cannot just totally dismiss it. It really depends on what it is that we are talking about. Is it a theory of language as a first order phenomenon? And then, strictly speaking, there is no theory of language. There is only a theory of communication, right? Because language can only occur as an activity, as part of communication. Or are we dealing with theories of languages, so description of languages that serve some pedagogical purposes, right? Where we somehow leave aside what we know is the case, namely that there are no languages, but still we somehow engage in a discourse that promotes, in a way, the belief that there are these language entities. So I don't think that the integrationist project aims to do away with the language countable concept altogether. It is more to raise our awareness of cultivating a relation with our own experience, right, rather than alienating ourselves from our own experience by becoming so-called scientists who look at languages and communication in a disinterested, impersonal way. Right? There is a danger in that, but in certain macro-socially defined activities, that is precisely what you are supposed to do, right? and so there is no way out of that tension for an integrationist.
Great, perfect. There are many questions coming, so I'm just going to follow the sequence. Lisica, she asks, Adrian, it's not clear to me if words mean what we make them mean, and they take linguistic responsibility for the words we use. In this case, what is the role of linguistics as a science?
Yes. Well, from an integrational point of view, there is no linguistics as a science, right? It is an impossibility. Linguistics as a science is based on a massive decontextualization, right? And in a way, ignoring our experience that we have to make words mean what they mean to us. We are assuming that words already exist, that they already have meaning, and that they are prerequisites for us to communicate with others. That would be the scientific approach to language. But if you endorse the view that signs are radically indeterminate, there can be no linguistics as a science. It's based on a myth.
Yes, that's the point. Thank you. And there is another question from Gustavo Lima. He asks the relation between thinking and language. So what is this? Do we need language to think? So if you could talk about this relationship between language and the thought and the act of thinking.
Yeah, I think when you start to look at the relationship between language and thought, there's the danger that you are actually engaging in a segregational, detached way, right? You're already trying to take something apart that cannot be taken apart from an integrational point of view. So I think for the integrationists, what we have experience, right? We know from our own experience that thinking and speaking, for example, are activities, and that we have to engage in these activities constantly, be it thinking, speaking, listening, reading and writing. But I don't think that there is any science of thinking, right? So already when we talk about thought, a thought as something countable, or thought as something non-countable, we are already talking within the discourse of the language myth, because we are no longer, or we are not happy anymore with just stating that thinking is an activity, and that we all know that we do engage in thinking, but there is not really anything that we can know more about that. There is no scientific study of the activity of thinking, I believe. Or else, if you want to do that, you automatically have to detach the activities of communication from the activity of thinking, right? You have to objectify the thought again, and then somehow theorize it as being related or not related to language, the way the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis operates, right? Or a Saussurian perspective. But from an integration perspective, I don't think it makes sense to actually theorize the relationship between language and thought.
Yes.
These are, as I tried to say in my paper, the limits of a lay-oriented approach, right? There are limits, but at the same time, it is something that can be unified as a theory that is difficult for anyone to actually reject, right? No one would like to reject that we engage in the activity of thinking all the time.
Yes, perfect. And there is another question from Daniel Carvalho. He's a professor here in Brazil at the Federal University of Bahia. He's also going to present a conference. And from this perspective, is there a concept of grammar? It's a very direct question.
Yeah. Well, grammar is not, from an integration point of view, grammar is not a reality, it's a construct. It's actually it's a pedagogical tool. That's how grammar actually was entered our discourse, in linguistics already in antiquity. But I think that grammar is not a reality in this sense. It is a second order concept. So it is part of lay thinking and lay speaking about language. It is certainly part of a professional, scientific theory of language, for example, in Chomsky linguistics, obviously. But I don't think grammar is part of a lay-oriented approach. We don't really need it.
Yeah.
But it is obviously a strong concept that, again, we don't want to do away with it, but at the same time there's no point in acknowledging it as a reality, because that ushers in all sorts of problematic concepts at the same time, right? We cannot really reject languages as entities, but on the other hand accept grammar, or the idea that languages have a grammar.
Great. And before we go to your final words, Adrian, there is a last question from Johan, who is your colleague, and he's also going to present a conference in the event. He asks, why would we say that such a theory of communication, as you described, it has to be a semiology? It would be a theory of meaning, but also of relationality, but not necessarily a theory of sign.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Johan obviously is asking me a philosophical question. A nice way to end the presentation. Yeah, why do we need the sign? I think in order to say that activities are being integrated, you need, of course, you could say meaning, like a theory of meaning, but would meaning cover everything we need for in integrational theory? Is Harris here somehow taking the sign because he wants to critique the Saussurean sign, right? The Western conception of the sign as having a form and a meaning, and therefore he's saying the sign is radically indeterminate in both form and meaning, right? Do we really need to say that indeterminate in form and meaning, if actually there is no form and meaning, right, from an integrational point of view? So the sign is in a way the act of interpretation of the individual, right? The knowledge of knowing how to integrate various activities, right, in the here and now, as the circumstances obtain right now for me and for someone else. Therefore, I find the concept of a sign a useful one. Relationality, I'm not sure. There is still this concept of interpretation, right, on the part of someone doing something. So to integrate something is also a form of doing something, right? And so we could also say it's a form of attribution of meaning, because you see something as being connected to something else, something as complementing something else. So it is obviously about meaning, but still the question really is it's actually a very difficult question, but it's a good question, because the sign, obviously, what some may see as problematic about the sign is that it is actually taken from a segregational discourse, right? Where a word has a form and a meaning, right? And somehow Harris seems to still want to have that, but at the same time saying that form and meaning are radically indeterminate. So I don't know whether that is a remnant from his admiration for Saussure as a semiologist, right? That he's saying the sign is a universal, right? We need signs in order to communicate, in order to engage in any activities, meaningful activities. There need to be signs involved. But I don't think I can give a good explanation of why it has to be semiological in this sense. Why not just meaning, for example? I really think that the sign functions here as a counter discourse by saying that the sign is radically indeterminate in both form and meaning. We are engaging in a counter discourse to the orthodox view of the sign, right? Where the at least the form has a certain, or has determinacy, and meaning often also is seen as being determinate. So I can explain it in this way. It's not really a good answer.
Johan is interacting with you. He says, thanks, Adrian, that makes sense. Okay. And Jessica said here, what I meant was whether linguistics shouldn't rethink its role and align with integrational conceptualization.
Yes. Yeah. Yes, that's certainly a good point, yeah. Of course, that would be in a way that would be desirable, right? As I've tried to show in this paper, however, once you acknowledge that, or you acknowledge the lay orientation as a semiological reality, then there are strict limitations on what you can do, right? So on the one hand, you open up, and you can explain everything by treating the sign as radically indeterminate, by using these integrational concepts in a lay-oriented sense way. But at the same time, it also massively restricts what you can do, right? Because it's always a theory of your communication, right? What you say about other people's communication is your interpretation of how others communicate. So it is really diametrically opposed to a scientific or third-person perspective. But I'm all for it, right? I don't need the third perspective. I'm happy with the first-person perspective. That's all we have, actually.
Great. Thanks, Adrian. Maybe we still have some minutes for your final conclusion, final remarks before we stop the transmission.
Yeah. So, well, I hope that maybe also in the next paper by Christine and Sinfree, we'll hear a bit more about lay theories of communication, right? Because that is, I think it's an interesting concept, first of all, and second, it's important to actually develop this relationship further, right? What is the relationship between a lay-oriented view, as I have talked about it, and the lay view of language, as Southern theorists actually endorse, right? And can the two be, or do we want to talk about lay-orientedness also in Southern perspective, right? Because I don't think that Southern theorists actually mean exactly the same as the Harrisian concept of lay-orientedness. So I hope that also in this conference on language ideologies, we can explore this a bit more, right? This tension between, as what I have on this last slide, right? This tension between lay-oriented theories, lay theories, and scientific theories of language. Very good, yeah. Thanks a lot, Christine.
Thanks a lot, Adrian. So before we finish, I'd like to remind everyone to visit the Language Policy Research Group channel on YouTube and check the future talks of this conference. There are several fascinating critical discussions on integrationism and language ideologies, and Adrian will be back here with his colleagues, Johan He will be mediating the interaction. So thank you so much, Adrian.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure.